The Oval Office of the White House, that famous desk, the American flag behind it, the presidential seal on the carpet beneath it. Every single man who ever sat behind that desk had a secret. Not a small secret, not something embarrassing at a dinner party, a real secret. The kind that gets buried in classified files, covered up by press secretaries, and debated by historians for decades after the man is dead and gone. We are going through the last 20 presidents of the United States, one by one. No protection, no spin. Just the truth about what they did when they thought nobody was looking, or what they did openly, because they were powerful enough not to care. Some of these will surprise you. Some will make you angry. And some will make you realize that the most powerful office in the world has always attracted men who were capable of both greatness and something much darker. Let's start. Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th president, a large physical presence of a man from Texas, taking the oath of office on Air Force One, standing next to a blood-stained Jackie Kennedy 3 hours after her husband was shot. Johnson's scandal is Vietnam, and the specific lie at the heart of it. The Gulf of Tonkin, August 1964. Johnson going before Congress and the American people with a story. American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam attacked twice by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. An unprovoked act of aggression against American forces. A clear justification for escalating American involvement in Vietnam. Congress authorizing the use of military force. Troops beginning to flow into Vietnam in massive numbers. And Johnson privately, recordings of his phone calls later released, his voice on tape, expressing serious doubts about whether the second attack had actually happened. Declassified documents and NSA records later confirming that the second attack, the attack that triggered the congressional authorization, almost certainly did not occur. Radar operators had misidentified weather patterns. Nervous sailors had reported contacts that were not there. Johnson knew the evidence was questionable. He used it anyway. 58,000 Americans dead in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese dead. A generation of American men sent into a jungle war based on an incident that the president himself doubted had happened. Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968. He retired to his Texas ranch and died 4 years later, a broken man who knew exactly what he had done and could not undo it. Richard Nixon, the 37th president, that unmistakable face with the heavy jowls and dark eyebrows and 5 o'clock shadow, standing at the podium with both arms raised in his famous double V for victory gesture. You already know Watergate. Everyone knows Watergate. The break-in, the cover-up, the tapes, the resignation. But here is the Nixon scandal that came before Watergate, the one that was arguably worse, the one that killed more people. Nixon, newly elected, inheriting the Vietnam War, secretly authorizing the bombing of Cambodia, a neutral country that was not at war with the United States, without telling Congress, without telling the American public. Dropping more bombs on Cambodia than the Allies dropped on all of Europe during World War II. The operation classified as a secret. The military falsifying records, officers filing false reports, creating fake coordinates, hiding the bombing runs in official paperwork to conceal what was happening from Congress and the American people. The bombing destabilizing Cambodia. The chaos enabling the rise of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot's genocidal regime, one of the most brutal governments of the 20th century, responsible for the deaths of approximately 2 million Cambodians. Nixon bombing a neutral country in secret, falsifying military records, and setting in motion a chain of events that led to genocide. And then on top of all of that, Watergate. Nixon sitting alone in the Oval Office late at night, the room dark except for one lamp, talking to the portraits on the walls. A man who had everything and destroyed it with his own voice on his own tape recorder. Gerald Ford, the 38th president, the only man in American history to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either office, taking the oath in the East Room of the White House on August 9, 1974, the day Nixon resigned. Ford was a decent man, an honest man by Washington standards, and 1 month into his presidency, he made a decision that ended his political career and may have changed American history. Ford in the Oval Office on September 8, 1974, announcing to the American people that he was granting Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for all offenses against the United States that Nixon had committed or may have committed while president. Nixon's face appearing on television screens across America. The man who had just resigned in disgrace, who millions of Americans believed should face criminal charges, walking free. The country erupted. Ford's approval rating dropped 21 points overnight, the largest single drop ever recorded at that time. His press secretary resigned in protest. Congressmen demanded explanations. The word deal appeared in every newspaper in the country. Ford insisted there was no deal, that he pardoned Nixon because a criminal trial would have torn the country apart for years and prevented any kind of healing. He was probably right, and it probably cost him the 1976 election. Jimmy Carter beat him by 2 percentage points in one of the closest elections in American history. Ford died in 2006. Many historians believe history judged him more kindly than his contemporaries did. The man who made an unpopular decision he believed was right and paid for it with his presidency. Jimmy Carter, the 39th president, a peanut farmer from Georgia with an enormous smile and a genuine moral seriousness that Washington had not seen in decades, sitting behind the presidential desk, looking like a man who was discovering for the first time just how complicated the world actually was. Carter's scandal is the Iranian hostage crisis and the allegation that nearly destroyed his reputation entirely. November 4, 1979. Iranian students storming the American embassy in Tehran. Crowds of young men climbing the embassy walls, cutting the chain-link fences, moving through the compound. 52 American diplomats and citizens taken hostage, blindfolded, hands tied, paraded in front of cameras for the world to see. Carter spending 444 days trying to get them out. Diplomatic negotiations going nowhere. A military rescue operation called Eagle Claw. American helicopters flying through the Iranian desert at night, ending in catastrophe when equipment failed, and 8 American servicemen died in a collision in the dark. The hostages being released on January 20, 1981, the exact day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. Not 1 day before, not 1 hour before. The timing so precise that it generated an allegation, the October surprise, that Reagan's campaign had secretly negotiated with the Iranians to delay the release until after the election, ensuring Carter would lose, keeping 52 Americans hostage for political gain. Congressional investigations found no conclusive proof. Key witnesses gave contradictory testimony. Documents that might have settled the question were never found or were classified. Whether it happened remains officially unproven. Whether the timing was a coincidence remains, to many historians, extremely difficult to believe. Ronald Reagan, the 40th president, an actor from California with perfect hair and a warm smile that made people feel like everything was going to be fine, standing at podiums and delivering lines with the timing of a man who had spent 30 years in front of cameras. Reagan's scandal has a name, Iran-Contra, and it was not a minor procedural violation. It was a secret government operating inside the government, doing things that Congress had explicitly made illegal. The setup: Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, a law, signed and official, sitting in the congressional record, prohibiting the United States government from funding the Contras, a right-wing rebel group fighting to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Reagan's National Security Council deciding that the law did not apply to them. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a Marine in uniform, intense eyes, a man who believed so completely in what he was doing that he never fully understood why others thought it was wrong, working from a basement office in the White House, running a secret operation. The United States selling weapons to Iran, the country that had held 52 Americans hostage, the country Reagan had publicly called a terrorist state, and using the profits from those weapons sales to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Selling weapons to a terrorist state to fund a rebel group that Congress had specifically made it illegal to fund. 2 laws broken, 1 secret operation, running from the basement of the White House. When it came out, Reagan went on television and said he had not been fully informed, that he did not know the full details of what his own National Security Council was doing in his own White House. Either he knew, which made him a criminal, or he did not know, which made him a president so detached from his own administration that his staff was running illegal foreign policy operations without his knowledge. Reagan survived. Oliver North was convicted on 3 counts and had his conviction overturned on a technicality. Nobody went to prison. The laws that were broken remained broken, and Reagan left office with approval ratings above 60%. George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, a patrician New Englander who had been CIA director and vice president, and seemed to believe that his biography alone qualified him for the job, sitting behind the resolute desk with the careful manner of a man who had spent his entire life being careful. Bush's scandal involves the same Iran-Contra affair, because Bush was Reagan's vice president and later claimed he was out of the loop on the entire operation. Diaries. Bush kept detailed personal diaries throughout his time as vice president. When investigators asked for them during the Iran-Contra investigation, Bush did not mention the diaries existed. He turned over some documents. He did not turn over the diaries. Years later, the diaries emerged. They contained entries that suggested Bush had known significantly more about Iran-Contra than he had told investigators. Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, a gray-haired former judge who had spent years pursuing the Iran-Contra investigation, announcing new indictments of former Reagan officials on December 24, 1992. Christmas Eve, 1 month before Bush was to leave office. Bush responding by pardoning 6 Iran-Contra figures on Christmas Eve, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, who had been about to go to trial and whose testimony might have revealed what Bush himself knew. Walsh called it a cover-up. Bush called it an act of mercy. The men who might have testified against Bush never testified against Bush. Bill Clinton, the 42nd president, a man from Hope, Arkansas, with extraordinary political talent and an extraordinary inability to stop making catastrophic personal decisions, standing at a podium, pointing his finger at the camera, and saying words that would follow him for the rest of his life. The Oval Office. Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern, an affair that Clinton denied under oath in a deposition related to a separate sexual harassment lawsuit brought by Paula Jones. Clinton before a grand jury, his face on television screens across America. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," said with conviction, said looking directly into the camera. The blue dress. Physical evidence that made the denial impossible to maintain. Clinton becoming the second president in American history to be impeached by the House of Representatives, charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. Surviving the Senate trial, finishing his term, remaining, inexplicably, one of the most personally popular politicians in America. The scandal that consumed 2 years of his presidency and handed Republicans a political weapon they are still using 30 years later. All of it completely avoidable. All of it the result of choices Clinton made in the same building where he was supposed to be running the country. George W. Bush, the 43rd president, son of the 41st, a man who had lost the popular vote in 2000 and had been handed the presidency by a Supreme Court decision, standing in the rubble of the World Trade Center with a bullhorn 9 months into his first term. The September 11th attacks changed everything, and what Bush did in the aftermath is the central scandal of his presidency. The weapons of mass destruction that were not there. Iraq, Saddam Hussein, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, a decorated general, one of the most respected figures in American public life, sitting before the United Nations Security Council in February 2003, presenting intelligence evidence that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, holding up a small vial to represent the quantities of anthrax that American intelligence believed Saddam possessed. The intelligence was wrong, or it was manipulated, the question of which one is still debated. American and coalition forces invading Iraq in March 2003, tanks moving through the desert, Baghdad falling, Saddam Hussein's statue being pulled down in Firdos Square. The declared mission: find and destroy the weapons of mass destruction. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. Not one. The entire justification for the war, the case made to the American people, to Congress, to the United Nations, was built on intelligence that was either catastrophically wrong or deliberately shaped to reach a predetermined conclusion. 4,500 American soldiers dead. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians dead. A country destabilized in ways that led directly to the rise of ISIS. A region transformed into chaos that continues today. And at the center of it all, a question that has never been fully answered. Did George W. Bush lie? Or did he genuinely believe something that turned out to be catastrophically false? The weapons of mass destruction were never found. The answer never came. Barack Obama, the 44th president, the first black president in American history, a former constitutional law professor, taking the oath of office in front of the largest inaugural crowd in American history, a man who had campaigned on hope and change and transparency. And then the drones, and then the surveillance, and then Edward Snowden. June 2013. A 29-year-old NSA contractor named Edward Snowden, a young man with glasses sitting in a hotel room in Hong Kong, releasing classified documents to journalists at The Guardian and The Washington Post. The documents revealing that the National Security Agency, with full authorization from the Obama administration, had been collecting the phone records of hundreds of millions of ordinary American citizens, not suspected terrorists, not foreign agents. Every American who made a phone call. The PRISM program. Diagrams and slides from NSA internal presentations showing that the NSA had direct access to the servers of Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and other major technology companies, reading emails, collecting data, building profiles of ordinary people who had done nothing wrong and suspected nothing. Obama, a constitutional law professor who had once taught the very laws being violated, defending the programs as necessary for national security, saying they had been approved by courts and overseen by Congress. The courts that approved them met in secret. The congressional oversight was so classified that the senators who knew about it were legally prohibited from warning the public. A mass surveillance program of every American citizen, run by a president who had taught constitutional law. The professor and the surveillance state, built by the same man, in the same presidency, at the same time. Donald Trump, the 45th president, a real estate developer and television personality from New York, the only president in American history to be impeached twice. First impeachment, a phone call, July 25, 2019. Trump calling the newly elected president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, the transcript of the call released by the White House itself, sitting in the official record. Trump asking Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and Biden's son Hunter, his likely opponent in the upcoming 2020 election, while hundreds of millions of dollars in congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine was being withheld. The aid Ukraine needed to defend itself against Russian aggression. A sitting president using military aid approved by Congress as leverage to pressure a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The House voted to impeach. The Senate acquitted along party lines.
Second impeachment. January 6, 2021. A joint session of Congress meeting in the Capitol building to certify the 2020 election results, a ceremonial process that had occurred without incident after every election in American history. Trump, speaking to a crowd of tens of thousands of supporters outside the White House, telling them the election had been stolen, telling them to march to the Capitol, telling them they needed to fight like hell. The crowd moving down Pennsylvania Avenue, barriers being pushed aside, Capitol Police being overwhelmed, rioters breaking through windows and doors, men in tactical gear, and men in face paint, and men carrying Confederate flags moving through the halls of Congress, breaking into offices, hunting for Vice President Mike Pence, who had been evacuated minutes before. The certification of the election delayed for hours. 5 people dying, hundreds of police officers injured. The peaceful transfer of power, the cornerstone of American democracy, never once interrupted in 230 years, interrupted. Trump impeached for incitement of insurrection, acquitted again in the Senate. The only president in American history to be impeached twice, acquitted twice, and then run for president again. Joe Biden, the 46th president, a man who had been in Washington for 50 years, who had lost a wife and daughter in a car accident in 1972 and a son to cancer in 2015, taking office at 78 as the oldest president in American history. Biden's scandal is not a single event. It is a question that grew louder with every passing month of his presidency. Press conferences where Biden lost his train of thought mid-sentence, the president standing at a podium, searching for a word that would not come, looking momentarily confused before recovering. Moments that were clipped and shared and played on loop on cable news and social media. The debate, June 27, 2024. Biden and Trump on a stage together. Biden's voice hoarse, his answers sometimes trailing off into silence, his eyes occasionally appearing unfocused. 90 minutes that led to a national conversation that the White House had been trying to prevent for 2 years. The question that Biden's own party was asking in private, and then in public, was the same question that millions of Americans were asking at home watching their television screens. Was the president cognitively capable of doing the job? Biden's team insisting he was fine, doctors releasing assessments, advisors pushing back against what they called unfair media coverage of normal aging. And then, July 21st, 2024, Biden announcing on social media that he would not seek re-election, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris, withdrawing from the race he had insisted for months he was capable of winning. The decision came too late for many in his party, and too soon for Biden himself, a man who had spent his entire life fighting back from losses and had never before chosen to step aside. Whether Biden's decline was hidden from the American public, and for how long, is a question his party, his staff, and history will be answering for years. The White House at night, lit white against the dark sky, the American flag moving gently in the wind. You have just heard the secrets of 20 men, 20 presidencies, 20 moments where the gap between the public image and the private reality became impossible to ignore.